Out here in the Wild West, a man's past rides with him.
The widow said she didn't need saving, but out here, even the strongest hearts still bleed. You ever met someone so broken? They'd rather drown alone than be pulled to shore. That was Evelyn Carter, a woman who lost everything, except her pride. And then came Jack Callahan, a cowboy with too many scars and a smile soft enough to wake the dead. She told him, "I don't need saving." He didn't argue. He just stayed. Out here in the West, love don't come with promises. It comes with patience, dust, and silence. But sometimes, the man who says the least ends up healing the most. Before we begin, take a moment to comment the name of your city. Where are you watching from tonight? And when this story ends, tell me, did the cowboy stay in your heart too? The American West in the late 19th century carried a scent all its own, the smell of burnt timber, dry dust, and a quiet kind of loneliness. Dust Valley was one of those places. Every time the wind passed through, it carried with it the sound of splintered embers and the unfinished stories of people who were simply trying to survive. And among all of that, there was one name folks spoke with a mix of pity and fear: Evelyn Carter. The 31-year-old widow lived on a sagging little farm at the edge of town. Ever since her husband died in a gunfight on Main Street, she had built invisible walls around herself, tall, cold, and unyielding. Anyone who came close was pushed away. Anyone who offered help was cut straight through by her icy stare. People said she didn't need anyone. Some whispered she no longer believed in light at all. That afternoon, a great storm tore across Dust Valley. Fences snapped, roof shingles flew, doors slammed shut like the weary sigh of an old, tired spirit. Neighbors rushed from town carrying rope, timber, tools, and worried voices. But Evelyn stood there, rain clinging to her clothes, hair plastered to her face, eyes tight as steel. "Go," she said. "I can handle it." They exchanged glances, then quietly withdrew, none daring to stay a moment longer. And then a lone figure appeared at the end of the dirt road, tall, unhurried, each step heavy as if he carried whole winters behind him. Jack Callahan, 38, once a famed gunslinger with a draw no one could read, but that was long ago. Now, his face carried soft traces of wind and sun, and his voice was low and rasped like night sliding across the desert. Jack brought no hammer, no timber, only a lantern glowing faintly in his hand. He stopped at her porch, gently placed the lantern on the step, and said, "Storms don't ask permission. Ma'am, they just come." Evelyn gripped the doorframe tighter, her voice sharp as iron. "I don't need saving." Jack studied her for a quiet moment. His eyes were kind, but deep as if he could see straight through every wall she ever built. Then he smiled slow, tired, but strangely warm. "Didn't come to save you. Just didn't want to see the dark wind tonight." Neither of them said another word. The wind swept across the broken roof, carrying the smell of wet grass and cold earth. Evelyn lowered her gaze, her hand trembling as she reached for the lantern. When the light flared, brushing across her face for the first time in years, her eyes reflected something Dust Valley hadn't seen in her for a very long time. Light, not bright, not blazing, just a small spark, enough to stop the darkness inside her for a moment. Jack stood a few steps away, hat worn, shoulders steady, silent as if his presence alone was the answer she'd been avoiding for years. And in that moment, in a Dust Valley heavy with ash and memory, their story began not with a vow, not with a grand gesture, but with a small lantern glowing softly on a woman who had forgotten how to believe in anything except her own pain. Part 1. The Broken Farmhouse. The next morning, Dust Valley still smelled heavily of the storm. Sheets of tin roofing were scattered all the way to the creek, and the fences leaned and twisted like broken arms. The ground in front of the porch was soaked, holding the marks of everything the night had taken with it. Evelyn stepped outside, arms wrapped around herself as the early wind slipped through her thin shirt. Her farm once filled with laughter, the sound of horses, and a man's footsteps fixing the roof now held nothing but the weight of silence. And in the corner of the western fence, a figure was bent over, Jack. His brown hat covered half his face, and his broad shoulders moved slowly with steady focus. He set each wooden post into the earth, turned it, lifted it upright, and hammered it in with blows as calm as the heartbeat of a man who never rushed anything in life. No noise, no announcement, no asking for permission. Evelyn gripped the strap of her apron hard. "What are you doing here?" she snapped, her voice sharp as a blade. Jack didn't turn around. The fence was down. "It's not your job." "Sure ain't." She stepped closer, irritation tightening her breath. "I don't need your help." Jack drove the last post into the ground, shifted the burlap sack of nails over his shoulder, and spoke so softly, the wind nearly carried the words away. "Didn't ask you." It should have sounded insolent, but it didn't. It was quiet, almost like he was talking to himself, not challenging her. Just stating a simple truth, this was something he chose to do. All morning, Evelyn watched from a distance, annoyed yet unable to look away. Jack never glanced at her, not once. He didn't speak either. He simply worked slow, steady, deliberate. Every time a gust of wind swept through, he paused, waited for it to pass, then hammered again, patient in a way that felt foreign to this land. She approached once more, her voice sharp. "Are you deaf or something?" Jack gave a slight nod, his hands tightening the rope around a post. "Heard ya. But if this fence don't go back up, the wild cattle will tear down what's left of your place. That's my problem." "Yep." He exhaled. "If you're fixing to do it yourself, I'll head on out." Evelyn froze. She looked at the broken fence, then at her own hands, then at the heavy gray sky overhead. She couldn't form an answer, not because she needed him, but because she hadn't let anyone stand this close in years. Evening crept in. The sun cast soft gold across the damp dirt. Jack removed his gloves and stepped onto the porch to grab more rope, only to stop. There, on the wooden wall beneath a thin coat of dust, hung a framed photograph, a young man with a gentle smile, his hand resting on Evelyn's shoulder, a snapshot from a time when her world was still bright and full. Jack went still. He didn't touch the picture, didn't ask, didn't look at her. He simply bowed his head, a quiet gesture of respect for the dead and for the grief he had no right to intrude upon. Evelyn stood at the doorway, breath catching in her chest. No one had ever done that before. They avoided the picture, pitied her, whispered behind her back. But Jack bowed his head. Calm, sincere, wordless. In that moment, even the wind across the fields seemed to soften, as if the west itself was holding its breath for something shifting inside her. For the first time in years, Evelyn didn't tell him to leave. She simply stood there, fingers gripping the edge of the door, watching the stranger rebuild pieces of a life she once believed would stay broken forever. Part 2. The Night with the Coyotes. Nights in Dust Valley were always longer than anywhere else, especially the nights after a storm when the earth breathed out its damp scent, mixing with wet wood and the cold that crept through every crack in the walls. Evelyn never slept well on nights like that. She listened to every sound, every gust hitting the roof, every heartbeat pounding too loudly in the dark. Then the howl rose long, cold, stretching the air thin. Coyotes. They traveled in packs on the darkest nights. Evelyn sat up sharply, reaching for the rifle hanging beneath the loft. She stepped out onto the porch, standing under the pale moonlight. The howls echoed from the tree line, growing closer. Her chest tightened, not from fear, but from the old habit of having to face everything alone since the day this house became too quiet. She tightened her grip on the rifle, eyes scanning the dark. A small lantern glow appeared behind her, steady, warm. Jack Callahan stepped out from the shadows near the horse shed, the lantern casting a soft gold across his features. He didn't ask why she was holding a gun. He didn't ask to come closer. He simply stood beside her, as if that was exactly where he was meant to be. Evelyn glanced at him. "I can handle it. You don't need to know." Jack lifted the lantern a little higher, shining it toward the brush where the howls had come from. The air between them grew still, quiet as a calm lake. Only the faint crackle of the kitchen fire drifted out with the breeze, and the steady breathing of the two horses in the stall behind them. And in the flicker of firelight spilling across the porch, Evelyn noticed something on Jack's wrist, just beneath the frayed shirt cuff, a long scar, puckered and uneven, as if stitched more than once. Not the scar of farm labor, not a horse fall, the kind of scar born on battlefields, and from mistakes Western men never spoke about. Her chest tightened again, not from pity, but from realization. He carried his own darkness, too. The wind swept under the eaves. The coyotes howled again, this time farther away. Evelyn still held the rifle tight. Jack still stood beside her, the lantern trembling slightly in the breeze. Then he murmured, voice low and rough, like earth settling after rain, "I ain't here to take your pain, ma'am, just to sit beside it." She turned to him, eyes widening in the dark as if she thought she misheard. But Jack wasn't looking at her. He kept his gaze on the tree line, holding the lantern firm as though what he'd said wasn't comfort, wasn't pity, but simply truth. Dust Valley had never been gentle to anyone. But that night, beneath the thin moon and the distant howl of coyotes carried by the wind, Evelyn Carter realized something she had never understood before. Some wounds don't need healing. They just need someone steady enough to stand beside them. Part 3. The coffee and the quiet dawn in Dust Valley always arrived on quiet feet. It didn't burst in with rooster calls or neighbors shouting across fences. On this dry land, the sun simply crawled over the distant hills, pushing thin gold light through the window like the softest knock on a door. Evelyn Carter woke before that light. Not because she slept poorly, but because she was used to mornings without anyone beside her, mornings where a widowed woman had to light her own fire, fix her own roof, and force herself to stand tall so she wouldn't sink any further. Her little wooden kitchen was so silent she could hear dust settling on the table. And yet, something felt different this morning. Not in the house, but in the way she stepped into the morning itself. For the first time in years, she walked into her kitchen knowing there was a man outside, a man rebuilding her fence as if this place had the right to let him stay. She lit the stove. The flame crackled against the dry pine and filled the room with its resin scent. She poured the roasted coffee grounds into a small pot, added water, and placed it over the fire. The rich aroma drifted through the house, twining with the slow-growing light of dawn. Evelyn leaned against the counter, cupping the warm tin mug in both hands. The silence made her aware of something she hadn't felt in years, her heartbeat, faster than usual. Outside, the hammer struck wood in slow, steady rhythm like breathing. Jack Callahan always worked that way. No noise, no pride, no waiting for thanks. She had pushed him away before, colder than winter frost, yet he came back. He had stood beside her in the dark last night with nothing but a lantern, and now he was here again, repairing her fence like it was simply a part of who he was. She listened to the hammer, the wind, and the quiet stirring inside her. Evelyn pressed her lips together, wrestling with a decision not of the mind, but of a heart that had been locked shut for too long. Then she poured a second cup of coffee. A small act, but for Evelyn, it was like stepping across a line she had drawn around her soul. She placed both cups on a tray, walked onto the porch, and saw Jack standing with one hand braced on a newly set post. The rising sun cast a long beam of light across his back, tracing the tall figure, the broad shoulders, the quiet intent in his eyes. He turned when he heard the door. And for a moment, Evelyn felt like she was facing a choice she never imagined she'd make. She drew a small breath, keeping her voice calm. "Coffee, if you want." Just 4 words, but to her, they weighed as much as a year's worth of pride. Jack looked at the coffee, then at her. He didn't grin, didn't look surprised. He simply nodded, slow, steady, the way Western men did when something truly reached them. "Thank you," he said, his low, rough voice blending into the morning air like a quiet blessing. They went inside. Evelyn placed the cup before him and sat across the table. Sunlight filtered through the window, lighting up the cracks in the old wood she hadn't yet repaired. Neither of them spoke. The only sound was the ticking clock, each beat like a light tap on the silence between them. Jack breathed in the rising smoke from his cup. It wasn't fine coffee, just the kind Western folks brewed to stay awake through long, quiet mornings. He took a sip, leaned back slightly, and looked toward the window. Evelyn watched him just a moment, but it was enough to notice something she'd never seen in him before. A deep exhaustion woven into his skin, his features, his breath. Not the tiredness of work, but the tiredness of a man who carried a past too heavy to put down anywhere. The wind slipped through the doorway, carrying the scent of post-storm earth. Evelyn wrapped her hands around her mug, letting the warmth seep into her chest. She wasn't used to someone else being in her home. She wasn't used to sharing silence instead of being alone in it. Yet somehow, this morning didn't feel uncomfortable at all. Jack folded his hands, eyes still on the sunlit prairie outside. He didn't ask why she invited him in. He didn't search for explanations. And that more than anything eased something inside her. After a long while, she broke the silence. The fence. She paused a moment. My husband used to fix it too. Jack didn't move. He set his cup down, fingers brushing the rim as if listening through touch. Evelyn continued, her voice rough with years of suppressed memory. He always worked on it in the mornings. Played around just like you do. Never waited for me to ask. Jack turned to her, his dark eyes softening. There was no pity in his gaze, no curiosity, only understanding, the kind carried by someone who had stood before someone else's grief and knew better than to tread on it. Then he spoke slowly, each word grounded like earth. "Then he taught you well, because you're still standing." Evelyn lowered her head, lips pressed tight to keep her breath from shaking. It wasn't comfort. It wasn't sympathy. It was truth heavy enough to touch the part of her she had kept hidden for so long. The little wooden kitchen seemed to grow wider. Morning light felt brighter. Even the ticking clock softened into a warmer rhythm. She looked at Jack for a long time, as if seeing him not through wary eyes, but through a heart she had forgotten how to use. Jack didn't look away. He held his cup, letting the warmth seep into his calloused hands. And in that moment, Dust Valley seemed to stop its wind long enough for two worn souls to breathe the same breath. Evelyn rose to pour more coffee. Her hands no longer trembled, and her steps no longer hesitated. Maybe she wasn't ready to open her heart fully. But this morning, the first morning in many years, she had opened her kitchen door to a man, let him sit and share a warm cup with her. A small thing. But in Dust Valley, the smallest things often mark the beginning of something far greater. And she felt it clearly. The fence wasn't the only thing being rebuilt. She was, too. And perhaps a quiet part of Jack Callahan's heart as well. Part 4, The Market Whispers. Market days in Dust Valley carried a rhythm unlike any other. The main dirt road turned livelier, dust swirling up from wagon wheels, vendors calling out their prices, the scent of ripe apples, baked bread, and dry hay blending into the air. But no matter how crowded it became, Dust Valley never lost its wary temperament, a frontier town where everyone knew everyone, and every glance held a whisper left unsaid. Evelyn Carter walked into the market with a basket in hand and a cloth hat blocking the sun. She hadn't been comfortable in crowds since the day her husband died. Every time she passed a stall or shop, she heard someone lower their voice, sneak a glance, then turn away. Not out of cruelty, but the kind of pity she could not stomach. The only difference today was this: Jack was walking beside her. The cowboy moved with quiet steps, his leather boots tapping softly on the ground, his wide-brimmed hat hiding half his face, making him both distant and impossible to ignore. His presence seemed to slow the entire market by half a beat. Whispers shifted quickly in their direction. Evelyn felt her shoulders stiffen. She had never allowed anyone to walk beside her here, especially not a man. Especially not a man whose calm eyes made every other stare around them feel small. "People are staring," she muttered. Jack looked around. He had noticed them long before she did, the curious eyes behind hanging tarps, the hushed comments behind fans, even the faint judgment under the tight smiles of ranchers' wives. But he didn't mind. He shrugged, voice slow and unconcerned. "Let him." Evelyn lowered her head further and walked a little faster. Her cheeks warmed. Her fingers tightened on the basket handle. She felt as if everyone was misunderstanding, thinking the cold widow suddenly had a man at her side, thinking Jack was stepping into a place no one had the right to fill. The thought made her shrink in a way she hated. They stopped at Mrs. Henderson's apple stall. Evelyn picked a few apples, trying to keep her expression neutral. But when she reached for another, Mrs. Henderson leaned in with a smile that was half pity, half insinuation. "Been a while since I've seen you walk with someone, Evelyn." Evelyn's fingers curled tight. She didn't answer. Jack, standing behind her, tipped his hat, politely cordial but distant, then placed a few coins on the wooden table before Evelyn could reach for her purse. She turned to protest. But he said, "Think of it as me, paying for the honor of walking behind you without someone stepping on my heels." Evelyn didn't know whether to snap at him or laugh. She did neither, just bit her lip and moved to the next stall. Whispers followed them like a headwind. Is that Jack Callahan, the Carter widow? Wonder what their story is. I thought she didn't let anyone near her place anymore. Each voice pricked Evelyn like a thorn. She bowed her head lower, her hand trembling just slightly. Jack, on the other hand, kept his pace steady. He didn't dodge the stares, didn't flinch at the murmurs. He was the kind of man no town could push into being someone he wasn't. His calm clashed painfully with the tightness building in Evelyn's chest. When they reached the flower stall at the end of the market, a place Evelyn never stopped at, Jack slowed down. His eyes landed on a small bundle of wildflowers. Thin purple petals, soft stems, the kind that grow along forgotten trails in the West. Evelyn looked at them, then quickly looked away. But Jack had already picked up a bundle, paid for it, and placed it gently in her basket. Evelyn froze. What are you doing giving it to you? I don't need flowers. Jack tilted his head, meeting her eyes. No one needs flowers. People just deserve them. Her heart stumbled. This time her face flushed not from embarrassment, but because his words struck something deep inside her. A part that had forgotten what it felt like to be offered something gentle. Around them, whispers rose again. Two women glanced over, whispered something, then laughed softly. Evelyn's breath hitched. She wanted to explain, wanted to pull away from all the eyes, wanted to say this isn't what it looks like. But as she gripped her basket, Jack stepped half a pace forward, turning toward the murmuring voices behind them. He didn't raise his voice, didn't bristle with anger. He simply said, clear as a church bell, "Let 'em talk." They forgot how love used to sound. For a moment, the whole market went still. No one answered. A few people looked away. Some pretended to fuss with their goods. Evelyn stood frozen, hands gripping the wildflowers as if they were the only thing keeping her upright. Not from shame, but because Jack's words had caught her by the shoulders and held her still. He wasn't here to pity her. He wasn't trying to replace anyone. He was simply choosing to walk beside her no matter what the world whispered. Jack turned back to her, his eyes gentle but firm. Heading home. Evelyn nodded. This time, she didn't bow her head, didn't avoid the stares, and she didn't drift away from him even by half a step, through a marketplace full of whispers. Evelyn Carter walked beside Jack Callahan like someone learning how to breathe again, and the small bundle of wildflowers rustled softly in her basket, a quiet sign of something unnamed, but already growing. Part 5. The letter she never sent night fell over Dust Valley like a heavy blanket, dragging with it both silence and the memories that never learned how to sleep. Evelyn's wooden cabin was darker than usual, lit only by a single candle on the table, its warm but fragile glow fighting to hold back the darkness seeping through every crack in the walls. She sat alone, hand resting on a sheet of paper yellowed with time. The old pencil trembled slightly between her fingers, as if it, too, didn't know where to begin. It had been years since she'd written a letter. The last time was the night they brought her husband's body home, wrapped in thick canvas, a night when she wrote him a long letter just to burn it, afraid that keeping it would make the pain cling to her forever. But tonight, something stirred inside her. Not longing, not the urge to cling to the past, but a strange need to say the things she could never speak aloud. She drew a slow breath and touched the pencil to the page. My love, If this letter reaches wherever you are, I hope it doesn't make you sad. She paused, watching the faint tremor in her handwriting, then continued. Dust Valley is the same. The wind is harsh. The nights are long. And I'm still standing, just like the day you left. I haven't fallen. But sometimes I feel hollow, like a house with no footsteps in it anymore. The candle flickered once, as if listening. There's a man. He fixes my fence in the mornings. He doesn't talk much. Doesn't try to look strong. He works like it's the only way he knows how to breathe. He isn't trying to take anyone's place in my life. He doesn't touch what's gone. He just stands beside me gently, as if he respects those pieces more than even I do. Evelyn stopped writing. A long breath escaped her chest. She tried to continue, but her hand shook when a quiet truth reached her. She was smiling. It was a small smile, like a spark beneath old ashes. She tightened her grip on the pencil, as if she could stop it, but she couldn't. In the candlelight, her cheeks warmed with a softness she thought had been buried with her husband. A tear slipped down, landing on the edge of the page and soaking into the thin strokes of graphite. She bowed her head, breathing slowly so she wouldn't break. A tear for grief, for memory, or for something growing inside her that she wasn't ready to name. She put the pencil down and picked it up again. Don't worry. I'm not replacing you. It's just that, for the first time in years, someone makes me feel like I'm not carved from cold stone. He doesn't take my pain away, but he makes me want to loosen my shoulders a little. Outside, the wind slid past the door like the night itself was sighing. Inside the wooden cabin, Evelyn leaned her forehead into her palm and closed her eyes. Strangely, she wanted to keep writing as if the paper was the only thing that understood what she'd buried. I don't know how long he'll stay. Men like him, the wind could carry them off at any moment. But tonight, he left his cowboy hat on my table. I looked at it, and for the first time, the house didn't feel empty. Her shoulders dropped. A second tear fell, then a third. But this time, she didn't wipe them away. The candle burned low, wax dripping in thin rivers onto the holder. Evelyn looked at the letter longer than she planned, more honest than she meant. Every sentence felt like a stone lifted from a wall she had built too high. She read the letter from start to finish. No line mentioned love, but every paragraph carried something even the most guarded heart couldn't deny. She had let a man step into her life, even if only a little. When she folded the letter, her chest filled with something strange, light, but not empty. Evelyn rose and walked to the window, opening it just a crack. The night breeze swept in, bringing the scent of wet grass. Moonlight spilled in soft, violet, resting on the table where Jack's cowboy hat lay, calm and round, coated in the dust of hundreds of miles he had traveled. For a moment, she thought she would walk outside and burn the letter like she always did. That was what she did with anything that made her heart heavy. But tonight, she couldn't. She returned to the table and placed the letter beside Jack's hat. Not sent, not burned, not hidden. Just set there, a quiet confession, left for the man who had stirred a part of her she thought was long dead. The candle gave one last glimmer before dying. The room sank into darkness, except for the moonlight spilling across the table. And on that table, A cowboy hat rested next to an unsent letter, two things belonging to two different men, yet somehow now part of the same story. A story that Evelyn Carter was finally ready to keep living. Part 6. The gunfighter returns that afternoon. The sky over Dust Valley felt heavier than usual. Gray clouds hung low, as if ready to swallow the small ranch crouched in the middle of the prairie. Evelyn sensed something wrong the moment the wind shifted. The horses in the stall paced nervously, and the birds on the fence scattered for no clear reason. She was gathering firewood by the stove when she heard hoofbeats, not one horse, but several. The rhythm was fast, forceful, urgent, like a storm warning beating against the earth. Evelyn's heart lurched. She looked out the window. In the distance, 3 riders approached, leaning forward the way men do when they carry guns and fear nothing. The Hollander gang. She knew the name. The whole town did. Her pulse hammered. Her hands tightened on the wooden basket until her knuckles went white. Jack. She whispered, a reflex she didn't want to admit. Jack was at the far end of the yard, inspecting the horse shed. He heard the hoofbeats even before she saw them. Without turning around, he said quietly, "Get inside." Evelyn. She froze, feet refusing to move. But inside. Now. His voice wasn't loud, but cold and firm as forged steel, the voice of a man who had lived with a gun long enough to know when trouble was riding straight toward him. The Hollander gang stopped at the gate, dust rising around them in a thick cloud. Hollander himself. The leader grinned with one corner of his mouth, tapping his fingers lightly on the grip of his gun. "Nice little ranch," he drawled. "Heard the widow lives alone, but looks like she ain't alone today." Jack straightened, eyes turning to ice. "You've got no business here." Hollander raised a brow. "The way you talk, I like it. But I came for goods, not manners." He signaled to the man behind him. That rider nudged his horse forward, heading toward the back of the house. Jack took one single step, just one, but it shifted everything. "Take another step," Jack said, "and I put a bullet in the dirt between your toes." The outlaw burst into laughter, but the laugh died the moment Jack drew his gun. His hand didn't shake. His face didn't change. A sharp crack ripped through the air. The bullet slammed into the ground inches from the outlaw's boot, kicking dust into his face. He jerked back in the saddle. Hollander's eyes narrowed, and Evelyn, watching from inside the door, forgot how to breathe. Jack didn't move. He stood like a carved stone, cold and immovable, his gaze sharp enough to make men step back without a second shot. "This ain't your place," he said. "Turn around." Hollander clenched his jaw. He looked around the rebuilt fence, the well-kept horses, the firm cowboy tracks in the dirt, and understood that the man in front of him was no ordinary ranch hand. "Another day," he growled. "But I'll be back. Want to see if the slow-draw cowboy can clean up the mess this widow drags around." Jack didn't answer. He simply lifted his gun again, drawing a line of iron between them. Hollander snorted, then spun his horse. "Let's go." The 3 men rode off, leaving a heavy cloud of dust behind. When the hoofbeats faded into the horizon, Evelyn burst through the door and ran to him, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. "Jack." He remained still until she reached him. Only then did he lower his hand and slide the gun back into its holster. She was trembling with anger and fear, her voice cracking. "Why risk your life? It's not your fight." Her breath shook. Her eyes shimmered fear, fury, something else. But Jack just looked at her. A calm, devastating kind of calm. And he spoke in that low, rough voice like stone grinding in the night. "You were never my fight. Evelyn, you're my reason. Evelyn froze. Even the Dust Valley wind paused for a heartbeat. He turned slightly, ready to walk away, but she threw herself into his arms. For the first time, she was the one who reached for him. She pressed her face against his chest, breathing in the dust, the leather, the warm scent of him, a safety so fierce it almost hurt. Her fingers clutched his shirt as if letting go would make everything disappear. Jack stiffened for half a second, just half. Then his hand settled lightly on her back, gentle as someone afraid to break something precious. On the wide, open plain beneath a storm-colored sky, two people who had worn their grief like armor stood together as if they had belonged there all along. And for once, Dust Valley, a place where the wind usually carried nothing but ashes, carried something rarer than peace, a fragile, flickering trust being born between two hearts coated in dust. Part 7. The Wound and the Waiting. The storm in Dust Valley that night didn't come from the sky. It rose from the fear tightening in Evelyn's chest when she saw the blood seeping through Jack's sleeve after the encounter with the Hollander gang. It wasn't much, just a scrape from a splinter that flew when one of them fired back in warning. But for Evelyn, even a drop of blood was enough to drag her back into the darkest nights of her life. She helped Jack into the small cabin beside the horse shed. It had once been her husband's repair room. Now it was the place where she tried desperately to keep another man from leaving her world forever. Jack sat on the old wooden chair, his breathing steady but heavy. He didn't groan, didn't complain, just watched her with that unsettling calm of his, as if a small wound meant nothing compared to knowing she was safe. Evelyn picked up a cloth, her hands trembling so much she had to draw a deep breath before touching the wound. "You need rest," she murmured, her voice rasping from both fear and anger. Jack let out a quiet laugh. "I'm still in one piece, ain't I?" But when she began cleaning the wound, his fingers tightened slightly on his knee. Not from pain, but because it had been years since anyone touched him with that kind of gentleness. The lantern light cast a soft glow on Evelyn's cheek. Strands of her hair slipped forward as she leaned in, brushing his shoulder. Wind moved through the cracks of the cabin, stirring the scent of dry grass. They said nothing. There was only the drip of water, Jack's steady breathing, and the loud, desperate thud of Evelyn's own heartbeat. When she finished bandaging him, she started to pull away, but Jack tilted his head, trying to catch her eyes. "You're shaken," he said quietly. Evelyn flinched, biting her lip and tucking her hands behind her skirt. "It's just the wind." Jack didn't call her out. He closed his eyes and let his body sink into the chair, exhaustion rolling over him like a desert wave. Within minutes, he was asleep. But Evelyn stayed. She watched him with a feeling she couldn't name. She pulled a chair closer and sat beside him. Her hand drifted toward his, not out of reason, not by choice, but because it was the only place that felt steady enough for her to hold on to in the long night. And then, she didn't let go. Near midnight, Jack stirred awake at the warmth on his hand. He blinked slowly like a man rising from a long dream and saw Evelyn asleep beside him, her head resting on the side of the bed, her small hand wrapped tightly around his. Jack watched her for a long moment. The lantern was nearly burned out, its last golden flicker trembling across her face, even in sleep. Her brows knit slightly, a habit of someone who had weathered too much pain alone. He shifted his fingers gently, brushing her hand. Evelyn's eyes opened. For a moment, the world stilled. No wind. No crickets. No darkness closing in. Just the two of them and the feeling that, for once, the world wasn't fighting against them. She looked at him, eyes shining under the lantern's dying glow. Her voice came out soft, barely more than breath. Maybe I did need someone, after all. Jack didn't pull her close. He didn't grin like a victor. He simply smiled small, warm, genuine, a smile that made her heart tremble. Then he spoke in that low, gravelly voice, each word falling slow and true. Didn't I tell you some storms take two to survive? Evelyn tightened her hold on his hand. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was standing alone in Dust Valley. The storm outside still roared, but inside the small cabin, two wounded hearts had found shelter, and perhaps the beginning of something new. Part 8. The Sunset Fence. Evening in Dust Valley had a way of making people stop and breathe. The sun didn't blaze or flare. It simply sank behind the distant hills, laying a soft gold across the prairie like a quiet farewell. The wind drifted through the dry grass, carrying the warm scent of earth and the soft whisper of the land settling into night. Evelyn and Jack stood side by the newly built fence straight posts, steady rails, the kind of Western promise that said no matter how fierce the wind blows, life can always start again from a single piece of wood. In their hands were brushes dipped in pale brown paint. The last light of the day glowed across Jack's arms, his broad shoulders, and the faint scar beneath the rolled-up sleeve. Evelyn glanced at him, then lowered her eyes again, trying to paint neat strokes, though the small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth betrayed her effort. "You paint terribly," she murmured. Jack raised one brow, glancing at his brush marks, then at hers. "Terrible's still better than your worm-crawling lines." Evelyn laughed a real laugh, soft and light, a sound Dust Valley hadn't heard from her in years. Jack looked at her for a moment, and the corner of his lips eased into a softer smile, warmed by the fading day. They kept painting. No need for conversation. No forced closeness. The comfort between them settled as naturally as sunlight on the fields. After a while, Evelyn straightened up, stretching her back. The evening wind lifted her hair gently behind her, revealing her deep brown eyes catching the golden sunset. Jack stopped. He watched her openly, slowly, quietly, with an admiration he didn't bother to hide. She caught his gaze. A faint flush rose to her cheeks. Her heart flickered, not with embarrassment like at the marketplace, but with the startling realization that someone was looking at her, not with pity, not with curiosity, but with respect. The wind swept across her face again, brushing loose strands of hair over her cheek. Jack kept looking. Unhurried, unashamed. Evelyn turned away, trying to hide her smile, though the soft tremble in her chest refused to be hidden. They painted until the sun left only a thin streak of gold on the horizon. Jack brushed the final rail, splattering a bit of brown paint on his sleeve and cheek, which he didn't seem to notice. He set his brush down and pulled a cloth from his pocket to wipe the sweat from his brow. Evelyn stood beside him, quiet for a moment. She looked at the finished fence, at the wet paint, then at the man who had helped her rebuild something she once thought was lost forever. Then she asked softly, just loud enough for the breeze not to steal it, "You're staying, aren't you?" Jack tilted his head, offering her a gentle, slightly mischievous smile as the last rays of sunlight cut across the bridge of his nose. He wiped his wrist, and in that slow, grounding voice of his. He answered, "Didn't I promise to finish this fence?" Evelyn laughed, but her eyes warmed in a way no laugh could hide. She understood him, and he knew she did. The fence now stood straight and solid, and between them something else was rising too quiet, steady, and warmer than any sunset Dust Valley had ever seen. The golden plain before them felt like a promise, and for the first time in a very long time, Evelyn Carter wasn't just standing strong, she was standing with someone. Part 9. The wedding that never needed vows. Autumn in Dust Valley had no red leaves, no forests blazing gold like the east. Here, autumn arrived quietly with colder winds, drier fields, and sunsets that slipped away just a little sooner. But in that simplicity, everything felt calmer, truer. Evelyn walked behind Jack along the dirt path leading to the old church, the one that had been silent for years, ever since the pastor left town. No fires had been lit inside it since. No hymns drifted from its walls. Only the wind slipping through broken windows and the soft settling of dust on abandoned pews. "Why are you bringing me here?" Evelyn asked, her voice trembling slightly, partly from the wind, partly from something she couldn't yet name. Jack pushed open the heavy wooden door. It creaked a greeting from the past. Inside, the late autumn light filtered through dusty stained glass, creating slanted beams that cut across the empty room. Evelyn stepped forward, her boots tapping softly on the dry wooden floor. A breeze swept through the old rafters, rustling a torn curtain like the sigh of a lingering spirit. Jack walked to the front, where the preacher's worn podium still stood. He turned around, holding something small in his hand, a dark brown leather cord, softened by years of wind and road. Evelyn's eyes widened. Jack. He stepped closer, close enough for her to feel the steady warmth of his breath. Not a ring. Just a promise. His voice was low as stone beneath their feet, gentle as wind through her hair. Evelyn lifted her hand to her mouth. Her heart crashed against her ribs. A leather cord, no sparkle, no gold, no gemstone, but it spoke louder than any wedding ring Dust Valley had ever known. "Jack," she whispered, her voice breaking like a secret undone. You don't have to, I know." Jack placed the cord gently into her palm. His fingers trembled just enough to show that this moment cost him every ounce of courage he had. "I know you don't need anyone to replace him, and I didn't come here to fill a space that isn't mine." He drew a breath, the evening light deepening the warmth in his dark eyes. "I just want, if you'll let me, to stand beside you, even if it's just one step." A hot tear slid down Evelyn's cheek. Just one, but it carried every year she had locked her pain, her loneliness, and the small, fragile hope she never imagined she'd feel again. She lifted the leather cord, wrapped it gently around her neck. When her fingers touched the softened leather, she smiled a trembling smile, lit from within by something she thought she had buried forever. Jack's breath escaped in a quiet, honest relief. "Beautiful," he whispered. Evelyn smiled through her tears. "You make me feel like I'm living for the first time again." Jack stepped closer, not even a full foot between them now. A breeze swept through the broken doorway behind them, lifting the old curtain as if giving silent blessing. Jack leaned in, speaking softly, each word falling into her heart like warm embers. "You said you didn't need saving. Guess love don't always ask permission." Evelyn closed her eyes, letting the words settle into every corner of the heart she'd kept locked for so long. Her fingers rested on the leather cord, feeling it sit against her skin like a gentle, steady heartbeat. No vows, no ceremony, no preacher. In an old church, in the quiet autumn of Dust Valley. They had a wedding without a single spoken oath, only the simple truth that two wandering souls had finally found their way home to one another. And sometimes, that alone is enough for a lifetime. Part 10. The Last Ride. Dawn in Dust Valley always arrived in colors. Only those who've tasted loneliness could truly understand. A little pink of hope, a little gold of a new day, and a little chill from all the things left unfinished. That morning was so quiet you could hear the hoofbeats of horses before you ever saw them. Dew clung to the tall and dry grass, catching the early light like dull silver. In that pale glow, Evelyn and Jack stood side by side, preparing to leave the place that had held them with both its wounds and its quiet miracles. Evelyn swung onto her saddle with the ease of someone born to ride. She turned to Jack, the man who had entered her life not with thunder, but with steadiness, silence, and warmth. Jack set his boot in the stirrup, straight-backed and calm, carrying old scars and a future he was finally willing to believe in. Morning light fell across Evelyn's hair, turning it into a halo of soft gold. She looked at him with eyes bright as dawn after a long storm. "You ready?" she asked. Jack tipped his cowboy hat, a slow grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Always ready, long as it's with you." They nudged their horses forward. Their hoofbeats fell in a steady rhythm like an old desert song carried across the plains. Behind them, the town of Dust Valley shrank, softened, then blurred into morning haze. After a while, Evelyn reached her hand toward him, hesitant, but sure. Jack looked down at that hand, then took it in his. Warmth moved through him, up his arm and into his chest, a quiet promise that the road ahead would not be walked alone. The morning wind swept through her hair, turning the strands into threads of sunlight. Jack watched her longer than he meant to, the way a man watches light he never thought he'd see again. He tightened his grip on her hand, reassuring himself that the moment was real. They slowed atop a rise where the prairie opened wide before them, endless, brightening, boundless. Mist drifted away, revealing fields stretching like a map of the future. Jack drew a deep breath and spoke slow, low, steady as a man who had known darkness and knew how to climb out of it. Some folks build walls to keep out pain, but sometimes love's the only thing strong enough to climb over. Evelyn looked at him, her eyes deep and shining in the newborn light. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she leaned gently into him, choosing him the way someone chooses a home they no longer fear losing. Jack rested a hand at the small of her back, drawing her closer. There, on the open prairie, two people once made of broken pieces felt whole for the first time. They urged their horses forward, leaving Dust Valley not to escape, but to begin again. A life shared, a journey no longer traveled alone. By sunset, Dust Valley lay behind them like a sheet of thin, golden silk. The wind on the hill carried the familiar scent of burnt wood, the scent Evelyn had lived with half her life. She and Jack stopped their horses on a gentle slope overlooking the valley. Evelyn stared down at the place that had once held her grief, her fear, her solitude, the place she'd believed would be her grave of quiet suffering. Now, from a distance. Dust Valley looked smaller, softer, like a story folded neatly away, no longer a weight, just a memory. Wind brushed her hair aside. Jack sat beside her, silent as the earth, offering nothing but presence, the truest promise a Western man could give. Evelyn exhaled not the sigh of someone tired, but the sigh of someone finally unburdened. She turned to him. Her voice was soft, but steady like a thread tugged free from her chest after years of being knotted tight. I said I didn't need saving, but maybe I just needed someone to stay. Jack looked at her. Sunset light touched his cheek, softening an old scar into something almost gentle. He tipped his cowboy hat, that simple gesture Dust Valley treated as a vow. And he said, voice low, warm, certain, "Then I reckon I ain't going nowhere." Evelyn smiled a real smile, steady and unafraid. The kind of smile that comes from someone who has finally learned she never needed rescuing, only companionship, only love. Jack reached for her hand, taking it slow. Their horses stood still. The wind was quiet. The sun dipped behind the hills in a final wash of golden light. And atop that ridge, in the hushed twilight of the Wild West, a woman who once built walls around her heart let love climb over them, gentle as wind, sure as the man beside her. If this story found its way to your heart, comment where you're watching from tonight. This is Wild West US, where cowboys don't just ride, they redeem. A cold cowboy loving through redemption. Second chances ride in the West. A love that saves a man from himself and a woman from her walls. Dust Valley faded behind them, but the story rode on with the western wind.
He found peace, not by forgetting his past, but by forgiving